The year is 1943, and the United Kingdom has become the world's largest aircraft carrier, armory, and barracks. Following America's entry into the war, a great flood of GIs, over 1.5 million of them, crossed the Atlantic, transforming the British countryside. They were the friendly invasion, and to a British populace weary from the Blitz and years of rationing, these confident young men from the United States represented more than just soldiers. They were the vanguard of liberation, the tangible promise that the tide of the war was finally turning. In villages and towns across the nation, the arrival of Americans meant music, cigarettes, and a welcome infusion of energy and optimism. But embedded within this army of democracy was a deep and festering contradiction. The United States military was a rigidly segregated institution, a mirror of the Jim Crow laws that enforced a brutal racial hierarchy back home. Black soldiers, though wearing the same uniform as their white counterparts, were relegated to segregated units, often assigned to grueling labor and service roles, and commanded almost exclusively by white officers who frequently held them in contempt. They were fighting a war against an ideology of racial supremacy, all while being subjected to a homegrown version of that very same poison. This inherent tension created a powder keg, and Britain itself became the unexpected fuse. The social landscape the Americans encountered was not what they had left behind. While not a racial utopia, British society, forged in the collective hardship of the People's War, often displayed a refreshing and, to the U.S. military command, a deeply troubling colorblindness. British pubs, the heart of community life, welcomed black soldiers, and friendships, and romances, blossomed freely. This simple, normal human interaction was seen as a direct threat by the white military police, who were determined to enforce the racial codes of the American South on the narrow, cobbled streets of English towns. The question was no longer if this volatile mix would explode, but when and where. The answer came on a tense June night, in the unassuming town of Bamber Bridge, the 1511th Quartermaster Truck Regiment. This was a colored unit, as per the military's official designation at the time, comprised primarily of African American soldiers. Their role was not in the frontline infantry, but in the vital, unglamorous world of logistics. They were the drivers, the mechanics, the loaders, the men who kept the endless river of supplies flowing. Without them, the tanks would have no fuel, the front lines would have no ammunition, and the armies would grind to a halt. They were, in every sense, the backbone of the coming invasion of Europe, yet they were treated as a subordinate class within their own army. Stationed in and around the small, unassuming town of Bamber Bridge in Lancashire, these men found themselves in a world vastly different from the one they had known, a contrast that would fundamentally shape the events to come. Their entire military experience was defined by the brutal system of Jim Crow, which had been formally imported into the armed forces. The American military of World War II was a starkly segregated institution. Black and white soldiers lived in separate barracks, ate in separate mess halls, trained in separate units, and enjoyed leisure in separate clubs. While the official pretext was often maintaining efficiency and morale, the reality was a deep-seated belief in white supremacy, codified into military policy. Black soldiers were largely barred from combat roles, funneled instead into service and labor battalions, reinforcing the racist notion that they were fit for little more than manual toil. Their command structure was almost exclusively white, with officers who often hailed from the South and brought with them the prejudices of that region. This institutional disdain was echoed at the highest levels. For instance, General Eisenhower's own staff produced a pamphlet for British civilians warning them about the childlike nature of black Americans, while other generals openly expressed the sentiment that this was a white man's war. For the soldiers of the 1511th, the uniform they wore was not a symbol of equal sacrifice, but a constant reminder of their second-class citizenship, even as they prepared to fight for the freedom of others. This made their reception in Britain all the more jarring and transformative. Britain in 1943 was a nation forged in the fires of the Blitz and years of total war. This was the People's War, a struggle for national survival that had, to a significant degree, leveled class distinctions and fostered a powerful sense of communal spirit and shared sacrifice. To the average citizen of Bamber Bridge, The color of a soldier's skin was far less remarkable than the simple fact that he was an ally, a long-awaited friend come to help finish the job. The black GIs, often more polite and reserved than their boisterous white counterparts, and possessing spending power that made them valued customers, were generally met with open curiosity and warmth. They were invited into homes, shared conversations in pubs, and danced with local women at village hops. For these African American men, many of whom had never experienced such a degree of social acceptance from a white populace, it was a liberating and profoundly disorienting experience. The simple dignity of being called "sir," or being served a pint without question was a powerful antidote to the humiliation they faced on their own bases. Inevitably, this cultural collision created intense social friction. The sight of black soldiers socializing freely with white British women, in particular, enraged many white American soldiers, whose own cultural background could not countenance such interactions. The white military police, or MPs, saw it as their duty not just to enforce military discipline, but to enforce the American racial order. They would routinely patrol British pubs, attempting to intimidate black soldiers and even demanding that pub owners establish segregated seating, a color bar. This was a demand that most British landlords and locals found baffling and deeply offensive. The pub was the heart of the community, a democratic space where such distinctions were alien. Time and again, the British response was one of defiance. Landlords would refuse to segregate their establishments, and locals would often side with the black GIs, telling the MPs in no uncertain terms to leave. This resistance from the very people the Americans were there to protect infuriated the MPs, who saw it as a betrayal. It emboldened the black soldiers, confirming that the prejudice they faced was not a universal law, but a specific and imported injustice. Every friendly pint in the old Hob-in was, therefore, a quiet act of rebellion, and every attempt by the MPs to intervene poured more fuel onto the simmering resentment. The stage in Bamber Bridge was not just set for a conflict, it was primed for a confrontation over the very meaning of freedom and dignity, with the cozy confines of an English pub serving as the unlikely front line. The tension that had been building for months finally caught fire on the evening of June 24, 1943. It was a Thursday, and the warm, lingering light of the English summer evening drew soldiers and locals alike into the streets of Bamber Bridge. For the men of the 1511th, it was a precious stretch of off-duty time, and many gravitated towards their sanctuary, the old Hob-in. The pub was a haven, a place where they could unwind, share a pint, and laugh with friends, both military and civilian, in an atmosphere of mutual respect. The air inside was thick with the familiar smells of beer, tobacco, and camaraderie, a world away from the rigid hierarchy of the base. It was in this setting of relaxed normalcy that the first deliberate spark was struck. The peace was shattered by the arrival of two white military policemen, Corporal Roy A. Windsor and Private First Class Ralph F. Ridgway. Their entrance was not that of fellow soldiers seeking refreshment. Their demeanor was confrontational from the start. They immediately focused on a minor and common infraction. Several of the black soldiers were not wearing the full prescribed field uniform, which included a necktie. In the relaxed setting of a local pub on a warm evening, this was a triviality, a regulation almost universally ignored by soldiers of all ranks during off hours. But for the MPs, it was a convenient and calculated pretext. An argument erupted, voices rising over the din of the pub. The soldiers, rightly sensing that the uniform was merely an excuse for harassment, pushed back against the intrusion. The situation grew heated, the air electric with the pent-up resentment of 100 previous slights. Yet, for a moment, cooler heads prevailed. Perhaps sensing they were outnumbered and that the pub's patrons were firmly on the side of the soldiers, the two MPs withdrew, leaving behind a pub buzzing with anger and indignation. But the incident was not over. It was merely in its first act. The retreat of Windsor and Ridgway was not an admission of defeat, but a tactical withdrawal. They returned to their post, reported a version of events that undoubtedly cast the black soldiers as violent and insubordinate, and gathered a heavily armed backup. Later that night, as the clock moved toward closing time, the conflict entered its deadly second phase. A jeep carrying at least 8 MPs, including Windsor and Ridgway, rolled back into the center of Bamber Bridge. Their intent was clear: to reassert their authority by any means necessary. They soon located Private Eugene Nunn, a black soldier who had been involved in the earlier confrontation. The MPs moved to arrest him, again on the charge of being improperly dressed. To the soldiers watching, this was not about a necktie. It was a clear message that the MPs would not tolerate their earlier defiance. The attempted arrest was the match thrown into the powder keg. A scuffle broke out as soldiers rushed to Nunn's defense, unwilling to see one of their own taken into custody over such a blatant provocation. In the chaos of pushing and shouting, the air was broken by the sound of shattering glass. A beer bottle hurled from the crowd struck one of the MPs. The violence had escalated from words to a physical melee. Then came the gunshot. It rang out, sharp and terrifying in the confined space of the street. To this day, it remains disputed whether it was fired by an MP or by one of the soldiers. But in that moment, the source mattered less than the meaning. The sound of a single bullet transformed a brawl into a potential massacre. For the black soldiers, the shot confirmed their deepest fears. This was not an arrest, it was an attack, and the MPs were willing to use lethal force. The social friction, the racial animosity, the constant humiliation, it all crystallized in that one explosive sound. Convinced their lives were in danger and with no faith that their own chain of command would protect them, the soldiers made a fateful decision. They broke away from the confrontation and rushed back toward their base at Mounsey Road. Their objective was no longer to socialize or to reason. It was to survive. And survival, in the face of what they saw as a murderous mob in MP uniforms, meant getting weapons. The spark had not just ignited a flame, it had lit the fuse to a battle. The return of the soldiers to the Mounsey Road base did not calm the situation. It became the catalyst for a full-blown crisis. As the men streamed back, their accounts of the confrontation, of MPs firing on them, spread through the barracks like wildfire, morphing and amplifying with each retelling. The air was thick with panic, rage, and a desperate sense of self-preservation. In the minds of the black GIs, the base was no longer a place of safety but a potential trap, and they began to arm themselves, not with a coordinated plan, but as individuals and small groups convinced that a white mob was coming for them. On the other side, the white officers and the military police command, receiving their own distorted reports, interpreted this arming not as a defensive reaction, but as the beginnings of a premeditated, large-scale mutiny. This catastrophic failure of communication and empathy, fueled by the very racism that had created the divide, meant that both sides were now operating under completely different and terrifying realities. The officers braced for an insurrection, while the enlisted men prepared for a siege. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense, but a bloody, chaotic, and sprawling riot that pulsed through the streets of the sleeping town. The American military machinery, so adept at waging war abroad, now turned its violence inward. Jeeps filled with white MPs, some armed with .30 caliber machine guns mounted on their vehicles, descended upon Bamber Bridge. They roamed the darkened lanes, their headlights cutting through the night, searching for armed black soldiers. They were not facing a unified enemy force, but scattered, frightened, and angry men who had taken up defensive positions in gardens, behind hedges, and in the shadows between houses. The night was fractured by the staccato bursts of machine gun fire and the sharper cracks of rifles, the red tracers from the MP's guns streaking through the darkness. The fighting was fluid and confused, a series of desperate skirmishes centered along Station Road and the area around the railway bridge. There was no front line, no objective, and no commander controlling the black soldiers. This was a spontaneous and tragic breakdown of military discipline, a raw human response to perceived existential threat. Each side saw the other not as comrades, but as the enemy, and the language of that night was written in bullets. The shooting continued intermittently for hours, a terrifying soundtrack for the civilians who huddled inside their homes. As dawn broke on June 25th, the grim toll of the night's chaos was revealed. The streets were littered with spent casings and broken glass, a scene utterly alien to the quiet Lancashire town. The most devastating loss was Private William Crossland, a black soldier found dead with a bullet wound. He was not the instigator, but a victim, a man caught in the storm of fear and hatred. The circumstances of his death remain shrouded in mystery. The fatal shot lost in the cacophony of the firefight, its source never proven. Alongside him, several other soldiers from the 1511th and a number of MPs lay wounded. With the daylight came the reassertion of formal military control. The armed resistance crumbled, not with a formal surrender, but with a weary, grim acceptance. The aftermath was swift and one-sided. In the following days, dozens of black soldiers were rounded up and placed under arrest. The army moved quickly to contain the story, to frame the narrative, and to assign blame. The Battle of Bamber Bridge was over, but the battle for its meaning, for justice, and for the souls of the men who lived and died through that long, violent night had only just begun. In the cold light of day, the official machinery of the United States Army swung into action, not to seek understanding, but to control the narrative and assign blame. The High Command, desperate to maintain discipline and uphold the image of a unified American force, moved quickly to downplay the severity of the event. The official reports and statements emerging from the upper echelons largely sidestepped the deep-seated racial tensions that were the root cause. Instead, they framed the incident as a disgraceful mutiny by undisciplined Negro soldiers. There were insinuations, wholly unproven, that the men had been stirred up by outside race agitators or enemy propaganda, a convenient trope that avoided any introspection into the military's own discriminatory policies. This official stance was less an investigation and more a containment strategy, designed to bury the uncomfortable truth that the Army's own systemic racism had nearly started a civil war on British soil. The legal aftermath was swift and overwhelmingly one-sided. In the weeks that followed, 32 black soldiers from the 1511th Quartermaster Truck Regiment were charged and faced courts-martial. They stood accused of the most serious charges imaginable in a military court: mutiny, rioting, and ignoring orders. The proceedings, conducted in the shadow of the Army's predetermined narrative, were a foregone conclusion. All 32 men were found guilty. Their sentences were severe, ranging from hard labor to lengthy prison terms, a brutal punishment for men who believed, with considerable evidence, that they had been fighting for their lives. The injustice of these convictions would hang over the participants for decades, a permanent stain on their records. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s, amid a broader re-examination of historical racial injustices, that these cases were formally reviewed. While full exoneration was complex, the reviews acknowledged the profound unfairness of the trials and the context of extreme provocation, leading to the clearing of their records, a posthumous vindication for many that came far too late. The tragedy in Bamber Bridge was not an isolated incident in the summer of 1943. It was part of a continent-spanning explosion of racial conflict. Just days later, on June 20th, the United States witnessed one of the worst race riots of the era in Detroit. Sparked by similar tensions over housing and social space, the violence there was far more brutal and deadly. Over 3 days of rioting, 34 people were killed, 25 of them African American, and entire city blocks were destroyed. The contrast between the two events is stark and illuminating. While the Detroit riot saw the deployment of federal troops who often sided with white mobs, the violence in Bamber Bridge was contained, in part, by the reaction of the local British community and police. The refusal of the British to endorse the American racial caste system created a crucial buffer. The hostility was directed almost entirely at the white MPs, not at the town itself. This critical difference in the social environment is often cited as a key reason why the death toll in Bamber Bridge remained at 1, a tragic but far lower number than the carnage seen in Detroit. The lasting impact of the Battle of Bamber Bridge is complex and multifaceted. In the immediate term, it sent a shockwave through the U.S. Army's command structure in Britain. While public statements remain defiant, internal memos and policy discussions reveal a reluctant, pragmatic recognition that their segregationist policies were a direct threat to military efficiency and order in the UK. This led to quiet, unofficial efforts to ease tensions, such as granting black soldiers more liberal passes and subtly cautioning white MPs against provoking confrontations in British pubs. It was a tactical retreat, not a moral awakening. The full integration of the U.S. military would not come until President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948, but the events in that small English town served as a bloody preview of the inevitable failure of a segregated fighting force. Ultimately, the story of Bamber Bridge stands as one of the war's most stark and painful contradictions. Here were American soldiers, prepared to give their lives to defeat the Nazi ideology of racial supremacy, yet forced to live under a system at home that enshrined its own version of that same poison. They were fighting for freedoms abroad that they were systematically denied within their own ranks. This paradox was not lost on them, and it fatally undermined the moral cohesion of the Army. The event is a powerful, tragic case study in how institutional racism is not merely a social ill, but a critical vulnerability that can corrode discipline, destroy morale, and ultimately, as it did on the night of June 24, 1943, lead to a tragic and entirely preventable loss of life. It is a forgotten battle that speaks volumes about the unfinished fight for democracy within the very nation that claimed to be its standard bearer.